There's a hill in northeastern Louisiana that this country spent 100 years refusing to believe was built by human hands. Just after dawn, one person stands on top of it, 70 feet up. Six long ridges of earth curving away below like a giant print pressed into the ground. This is Poverty Point. It went up more than 3,000 years ago, older than Rome, raised by hand, with no metal, no wheel, and no farms. And for 100 years, Americans looked at it and decided the native people living beside it could not have built it. But they did. This is the story of who built it and why we spent so long pretending it was someone else. Start at ground level, because the numbers only mean something once you've stood inside the shape. Poverty Point sits on a low ridge above a bayou in the northeast corner of Louisiana, not far from the Mississippi. The earthworks spread across hundreds of acres. 6 ridges of piled earth, laid out in those big nested C-shapes, wrap around a wide, flat plaza where you could fit dozens of football fields. And rising over the western edge is the thing that person is standing on at dawn. Archaeologists call it Mound A. It's about 72 feet tall, roughly 22 meters, and it is the second largest earthen mound anywhere in North America. Only Monk's Mound at Cahokia, built more than 2,000 years later, is bigger. Now put a date on it, because the date is where it starts to feel unreal. The people here were building between 1700 and 1100 BCE. Rome didn't exist yet. It wouldn't exist for another 600 years. In Egypt, the Great Pyramids were already ancient, and the pharaohs of the New Kingdom sat on the throne. While all of that was happening on the other side of the world, one of the biggest earth-moving projects anywhere was underway on a bayou in Louisiana. Some people have called this the largest settlement in North America at the time, the city of its moment, if you can call it a city. And almost nobody you know has heard of it. Here's what makes the whole place hard to hold in your head. To build the earthworks at Poverty Point, people moved close to 1 million cubic yards of dirt by hand. No bulldozers, obviously, but also no carts, no wheelbarrows, no oxen, no horses, nothing that could pull a load for them. Every basket of earth in every one of those ridges was carried on somebody's shoulder and set down where it still sits today. When you stand in the plaza and look up at Mound A, you're looking at somewhere around 8 million basket loads of soil, stacked into a hill taller than a 7-story building. To give you a sense of that, if you tried to move that much dirt today with a modern 10-wheel dump truck, it would take you more than 30,000 loads. So this is a monument on the scale of the ancient wonders sitting quietly in the American South, older than almost anything most of us can name on this continent. And for a very long time, the country it sits in could not accept who made it. To see why, you have to go back to the 1800s, into a debate that gripped educated America. All across the eastern half of the country, settlers kept running into these mounds. Enormous earthworks, clearly deliberate, clearly old, some of them shaped with real precision. And a lot of white Americans looked at them and decided the native people they saw around them simply could not have done this kind of work. The arguments they used were laid out plainly at the time. Indians, they said, were too primitive to have raised the mounds. The mounds looked far older than any native culture they recognized. Some of them held worked copper and other metalwork which these settlers refused to believe native people could produce. And when they asked the native communities nearby about the mounds, those communities often said they didn't know who had built them, which the settlers took as proof rather than as the obvious result of a century of displacement and broken memory. So the mounds needed another author, and the theories got elaborate. Maybe it was a lost tribe of Israel, maybe wandering Vikings, or Egyptians, or refugees from a drowned Atlantis. Maybe a vanished race of giants who ruled the land before the Indians and then disappeared. Whole books were written about it. Newspapers ran with it, and presidents repeated it as fact. There grew up an entire believed-in history of a superior lost people who raised these wonders and then conveniently vanished, leaving the land empty for whoever came next. And that last part is the part worth sitting with, because the myth was never really about archaeology. It was about ownership. A country in the middle of taking this land from the people who lived on it had every reason to prefer a story where the real builders had already died out long ago. If the mounds belonged to some lost race that no longer existed, then they didn't belong to the native nations being pushed off the very ground they stood on. The fantasy did a job. It made the taking feel cleaner. The people who actually built the mounds were standing right there the whole time. They were the ancestors of the native communities the country was displacing. And here's the thing that gets lost. This was never a real scientific mystery that got solved. There were people saying so the entire time. Thomas Jefferson, of all people, dug into a mound on his own land and concluded it was the work of Native Americans. The explorer John Wesley Powell called the lost race idea a romantic fallacy. The answer was available. It was just inconvenient, so the country looked away from it. Eventually, the looking away ran into hard evidence. In 1881, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, then headed by that same John Wesley Powell, put an archaeologist named Cyrus Thomas in charge of settling the mound question for good. His crew spent years digging mounds across the eastern United States, and in 1894, Thomas published a report of more than 700 pages that took the lost race theory apart, piece by piece. His conclusion was blunt. There was, in his words, an unbroken chain connecting the mound builders and the historical Indians. The people who built the mounds were the ancestors of the communities still living beside them. No lost tribe, no giants, no vanished superior race. Just a refusal to look, finally overruled by the evidence. So the great mystery of who built the mounds was never much of a mystery at all. The answer had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, and that would be the end of it. A lie raised and then corrected, except that the ground at Poverty Point had one more surprise buried in it. Because once you accept who built this place, a much harder question opens up underneath. How? How did they actually do this? That question got a lot sharper about a decade ago, when a team led by the archaeologist T.R. Kidder of Washington University in St. Louis, along with the geoscientist Anthony Ortman, went deep into Mound A. They drilled cores down through the whole structure and pulled up long columns of soil so they could read the mound the way you would read the layers of a cake. They were looking for the record of how it was built, how many stages spread over how many years, and they found something they weren't expecting. They found nothing. No layers of rainwash, no bands of silt where water had run down a slope and pooled. No weathered surface where the mound had sat exposed to the sky between one building season and the next. In a structure made almost entirely of dirt, in one of the rainiest corners of the country, there was no sign that rain had ever touched it while it was going up. Sit with what that absence means, because it's the whole discovery. This part of Louisiana gets heavy rain, and it always has. Kidder's point was simple. You could not leave a raw pile of earth this size sitting out here for even a single season without rain cutting channels into it and leaving a scar you could still read thousands of years later. The fact that there is no such scar means the mound never sat and waited. It didn't rise slowly, a little each year across generations, the way everyone had assumed, for a century. It went up in one continuous push, and their estimate for that push was under 90 days. Possibly, they said, as few as 30. Think about what you would need to pull that off. A mound of roughly 238,500 cubic meters of soil raised in a single season by people carrying it in baskets. The researchers estimated the work itself would have taken something like 3,000 laborers going the whole stretch. And those laborers had to eat and sleep and be organized and fed, which means the number of people who actually gathered here was larger still, maybe as many as 9,000 once you count the families who came with them. Thousands of people converging on one spot on a bayou, housing and feeding themselves, coordinating a build, and finishing a small mountain of earth before the weather could touch it. And they did it as a bucket brigade, people standing in long lines, passing baskets and hide sacks of soil hand to hand, dumping small loads that grew over weeks into a 70-foot hill. No draft animals to help, no wheels to roll it, no metal tools to dig with, just an enormous number of people moving in time with each other. You get another measure of that reach from what they carried in from the outside. When archaeologists dig here, they keep pulling up materials that have no business being in Louisiana. Copper from the Great Lakes, roughly 1,400 miles to the north, soapstone from the Appalachian foothills of Alabama and Georgia, stone and flint from the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, quartz crystal from the Ozarks, lead ore, seashells from the Gulf Coast. There is no natural stone on this ridge at all, not a pebble of it. So every hard rock on the site was hauled in from somewhere else, carried down the rivers by canoe. One archaeologist estimated that more than 71 metric tons of foreign flint alone ended up on this site. Poverty Point was the hub of a trading web that reached across much of eastern North America, at a moment we tend to picture as scattered bands of foragers with no connection to each other. And here's a small human detail that tells you as much as the big numbers do. Because there was no stone on this ridge to heat for cooking, the people here made their own. They rolled moist clay into little balls in the palms of their hands, fired them hard, and dropped the hot balls into earth ovens to bake and steam their food, the way other cultures used hot rocks. Archaeologists have found millions of these baked earth balls across the site, shaped by hand into different forms, some of them marked with careful little designs. And the same hands that moved a small mountain of dirt also sat and carved tiny beads and pendants, including a set of little pot-bellied owls out of red jasper, small enough to hold in your palm. That turn up at sites from Louisiana all the way to Florida. It's worth sitting with that. The people who moved a mountain of earth were also the ones who sat down to roll clay and carve beads by hand. And then there is the dirt itself, which turns out to be the cleverest part of all. When the team looked at the soil under a microscope, they could see the builders hadn't just piled up whatever was nearest to hand. They had deliberately mixed different earths, clays and silts and sands, in combinations chosen to bind together, shed water, and resist slumping. Kidder has compared it to Roman concrete or to the rammed earth the Chinese used to build their walls. He has said there is a kind of engineering in it that we still don't completely understand. Remember, this hill was never packed down by machines. It was built out of loose soil carried by hand, and it has held its shape through more than 3,000 years of Louisiana weather without washing away. If you're finding this as strange and as good as I am, take a second to subscribe. I go looking into one of these every week. Now hold everything you've just heard up against the one detail that breaks the entire rule. The people who did this were hunter-gatherers, foragers and fishers, living off what the land and the rivers gave them. They had no farms. There is no sign of a king here, no palace, no evidence of a ruling class that owned everyone else's labor. And for a long time, the assumption across archaeology was that you needed exactly those things first. You needed agriculture to grow a food surplus, and a powerful elite to command a workforce, before any society could build something monumental. Farms, then rulers, then wonders, always in that order. Poverty Point is that order broken. Here is a society with none of the supposed prerequisites, outbuilding most of the ancient world that had all of them. And that is precisely what Kidder said the discovery meant. It is some of the first hard evidence that early hunter-gatherers were nothing like as simple as we'd imagined them. They could pull thousands of people together, feed them, and coordinate a build on this scale, apparently without anyone standing over them forcing it to happen. Which is where the honest part of this story has to come in, because the reversal is settled, but the full accounting is not closed. Let me be clear about what is actually known and what is not. That native hunter-gatherers built Poverty Point is not in question. The lost race never existed. Cyrus Thomas was right in 1894, and every shovel of dirt turned since has only confirmed it. That part is done, and it should never have taken as long as it did. But the deeper questions are wide open, and the researchers are the first to say so. That under 90-day figure is one team's strong reading of the cores, and it is for Mound A specifically, not for the whole site, which took shape over many centuries. What the place was even for is still argued. It doesn't look like a permanent town. The layer of everyday household trash you'd expect from people living somewhere full-time is surprisingly thin here, which suggests Poverty Point was a place people traveled to, rather than one they stayed in, a gathering place, a site for ceremony or trade, or feasting, or very likely all three at once. Even the popular idea that one of the mounds is shaped like a giant bird is contested among the people who study it. And the biggest question is the one those cores cracked open. If there was no king and no ruling class, then how? How does a society with no central authority persuade thousands of people to leave their own territory, travel to a bayou and haul a mountain of dirt in baskets for 3 months straight, and then simply go home? What held all of that together? Was it belief? Some shared ceremony powerful enough to move that many hands at once? Was it the trade? The sheer pull of a place where the goods of half a continent flowed through? We honestly don't know. The more recent work leans toward a genuinely equal society, people choosing to come and build, with authority that was momentary rather than owned by anyone. But that is a careful reading of what got left behind in the ground. And the ground doesn't tell us everything. So the mystery didn't disappear when the lost race did. It just changed shape. The question of who built these mounds was answered a long time ago. The question the cores raise is how a people with no rulers and no farms ever pulled it off. And that one is still wide open. For about 100 years, this country was asking the wrong question. It kept asking, who else could possibly have raised these mounds? And the answer, the ground keeps handing back core sample after core sample, is that there was no one else. The people who were always here built them. The answer isn't a lost race or giants or visitors from somewhere far away. It's just people working together for a single season for reasons that mattered enough to move thousands of them at once. And that is the more remarkable answer. A monument on this scale never needed kings or farms or an empire standing behind it. It only ever needed enough hands and a reason to lift them. That is the dignity the myth spent a century stealing. And it is worth handing back plainly. The people who raised Poverty Point were not a footnote to somebody else's civilization. They were the whole story. They did the impossible-sounding thing with baskets and shoulders and a single season of coordinated work, and then a country that wanted their land decided the credit had to belong to anyone but them. Today, the ridges lie soft under grass, and most people drive right past without any idea what they are. The answer to how it was done keeps surfacing, a few core samples at a time, and there is clearly a great deal of it still waiting down there. We spent 100 years inventing a lost race rather than credit the one standing right in front of us. So I will leave you with a question I can't stop turning over. What do you think made us need them to be someone else? Tell me what you think down in the comments.